So in this section, we're going to talk about interview technique. And this follows on from the first sections of the podcasting course, where we looked at podcasting as a whole, and also we did a bit about audience identification. So it's assumed you have an idea for a podcast, you've identified the audience. And this is all still part of the preparation stage. So we're going to talk about a basic approach to interviewing, how one might go about preparing an interview, question technique, what happens during the interview, what happens after the interview, and then a few random observations from my own experience. Now, my own experience it's extensive, but it's limited. I mostly interviewed musicians for the radio show that I used to do, and I mostly interview technology or computing professionals and academics and students for podcasts. Now, I have interviewed other people like sports people and things like that. I don't really have much of an experience with the combative interview, like interviewing politicians or people like that. I don't really have an interest in it either, like listening to it. It's not something I'd be interested in doing. Just to lay things out as to where I'm coming from, I just want to talk about myself very, very briefly as to where I am and what my background is. So I am a full-time lecturer in SETU. I'm in the Department of Computing and Mathematics. I specialise in computer science and also digital media. I did work on radio for a large number of years. I hosted a contemporary Irish music show for a number of years on Beat 102, 103 in the Southeast. Nowadays, I host a number of podcasts, specifically The Machine and 9plus. I also produce podcasts for other people, mostly in the academic sphere. Been involved in a number of documentaries and things like that down throughout the years. I've been up for a couple of awards, never won anything, but there you go. I have a huge interest in music. I'm also a musician, and I have worked extensively in music, playing in bands. Over the last number of years, I've done a lot of kind of sound design work. I've done a lot of stuff with theatre. So that's just to tell you where I'm coming from. So if I'm talking to you, my experience is based on talking to musicians, talking to academics, talking to tech people. Your experience might be different. I mean, they're still people, but it isn't that kind of hard-hitting journalistic type of interview, though I am going to reference that type of stuff as we go. So what is an interview? So what's the aim of an interview? Basically we want to get some information across in a kind of a dialogue type style. It's usually in the interviewee's own words. And the other thing is you can let the listener form their own opinion on what the interviewee is saying. You don't necessarily have to spell it out for them. Ideally, the interviewer has a certain element of objectivity in that you try not to fawn over your guests, or equally you don't want to be hostile to them either. And actually aggressive questioners can kind of alienate the audience because it just comes across as rude. At the same time, you don't want to bring somebody on and just let them, say whatever they want unchallenged, particularly if they say something controversial, shall we say. You don't want to, you should be able to challenge people respectfully on any ideas that they say. The interviewer's job is quite simple, but it's also kind of deceptively simple. Prepare well, ask appropriate and searching questions, and listen to what the interviewee is saying, and, follow up on what they say. An interview should be a spontaneous event. You don't want it to be scripted and pre-prepared because it comes across as quite stilted otherwise. The best interviews are where it just seems like you're eavesdropping on an amazing conversation between people who really know their stuff. And for me, it's probably the most valuable aspect of podcasting or broadcasting as a whole. I love listening to really good interviews where people are discussing a subject and I feel I'm learning something. Some interview subjects are extremely well versed with interview technique. If they're professionals, they may have received PR, public relations training, particularly politicians, people in higher roles in business. And other people will have no experience with being interviewed or recorded. You need to be careful of this across all, you know, from the people who are very well prepared and the people who are not prepared at all. Some professionals might be quite nervous about being interviewed because they're worried about looking foolish or saying the wrong thing. Equally, you don't want somebody who has extensive experience to take over the interview and basically flip the tables so that they just can run riot and say what they want. So you got to be careful about this. So if you want to conduct an interview with somebody, well, the first thing you have to do is, you know, get their consent. You must ask them, hey, can I interview you for my podcast? Now, there's a number of different ways you can go about doing this. Probably the easiest way is to just ask them. You know, it might be somebody you know, or maybe it's an organization whom you have an arrangement with or who you have contact with. You can send them an email. You can pick up the phone and talk to them in person, or better yet, if you know them, you might actually just call over to them. But ask people if you want to interview. It's quite simple. Just make sure you're respectful when you ask somebody. If you're approaching somebody, particularly a professional person, you must approach them in a professional capacity. If you're emailing them, that means make sure it's a respectful email. It is spelled correctly. I have a very good friend who is the CEO of a company. And if she sees emails coming in that are full of spelling mistakes and grammatical errors, it just goes in the bin straight away. So you want to watch out for that because, you know, you want to present a good version of yourself. But let's say you've secured an interview. Somebody has agreed that they're going to, you know, yes, I'm quite happy to be interviewed by you and come on your podcast. What you've got to do then is arrange a time and a date and a location. Even if it is online, you say we're going to meet on Zoom, okay? If it's an international person, you might want to make sure the time and date are in a kind of a common form. So if you say it's in Irish time and they're based on the East Coast of America, you make sure you also give them the East Coast of America time as well. What you should tell the interviewee is what the interview it will be about. So maybe it's about a book that they've written or a new album that they've released or their role as the chief technological officer of a company, whatever it might be. Okay. So what the interview is about, the scope of the interview, how long the interview will be, roughly how long you think it's going to take them. Like this, it should take us an hour to do this, or it should take 30 minutes or whatever it might be. What is the context? So this is for a podcast. It's for a student podcast. It's for a student podcast on computer science education or whatever it might be. Or it could be part of a wider discussion on the topic. For example, let's say in the machine, we're doing a series on artificial intelligence and we'd love to feature this particular person in as part of a wider series. So we're also going to have person X, Y, and Z, and we'd love to have you on it. You should tell them who the audience are. Again, that allows them to pitch their conversation accordingly. And then, of course, where and when the interview will take place. Now, this all sounds very, very simple. It sounds like common sense, but as we all know, common sense, the strangest thing about it is how uncommon it actually is. When you're preparing, you must think about what you want to achieve. What are you trying to get out of it? I don't mean in a selfish capacity, but I mean, what are you hoping comes across from the you should always be in control. You should make sure you cover any topics that you wanted to cover. If you're going to present questions to them, you want to make sure they're well researched. So you want to make sure you have things like dates, times, values, all the details correct. Because if you're asking questions that are inaccurate, like for example, why did you introduce this system 6 months ago? And they say, actually, we brought it in 2 years ago. That just shows that you haven't done your research, and it means you will have a loss of credibility. So there you go. Normally what you should do is research the subject, arrange for the interviewee to come in or interviewees. You should have knowledge on what the interview wants to achieve and what length the interview will be, and to know what the key questions are. So you might have 10 questions that you want to ask, but you should also anticipate likely responses to certain questions so that you can have supplementary or follow-up questions. But also you should be able to come up with questions on the fly based on what somebody is saying. And I would always reserve the right to, reserve the right. It makes it sound like it's some sort of entitlement. I would always, if somebody says something interesting in an interview that I hadn't anticipated, I might go there. I might ask him a bit more about it, even though it might not necessarily be on my question sheet in it. But basically, to give it a short version, do your research. Now, kind of when you're getting ready for an interview, just kind of at the start of an interview or just the pre-interview, the first couple of minutes are really important because they're going to set the tone for how everything else is going to go. You want to set things up in a professional way. So you want to be polite. You don't want to annoy somebody at the start of an interview because that's just going to make sure everything nosedives straight away. Equally, you don't want to be completely fawning or like fanboyish about them because that can, from the listener's perspective, it can make it sound unprofessional because it can make it sound like you're just gushing over this person rather than having a serious conversation with them. Now, there's no standard approach to this either. And I'm not saying you have to be entirely objective because you're not a robot. But you want to just do this in a professional manner, and you want to do it more than just rambling on about nothing. You should also clarify again how long you think the interview will last. Now, the reason why this is important is if you have said to somebody, "Oh, this is going to take 30 minutes," particularly if they're a professional person, they might be busy and they might have arranged for something to happen in 45 minutes. So if the interview is going to go over that time, that might affect their day. So, be truthful about how long you think it's going to take. When I'm doing most of my podcasts, I normally say it's going to take about an hour, even though I'm aiming to record for maybe 30 minutes, because that gives us a little few minutes to maybe, get a cup of coffee, set up any mics that we're setting up. And it also just gives me a little bit of wiggle room if things overrun at all.